Beneath the streets of Beijing, under the subway lines, the shopping malls, the apartment towers, and the endless flow of 16 million people, there is another city. You cannot see it from above. You cannot find it on most maps. But it is there, carved into the earth across hundreds of miles of tunnels, chambers, and hidden corridors. These tunnels stretch beneath almost every major district of the Chinese capital. Most Americans have never heard of it. And that is exactly the way the Chinese government wanted it. This is the story of Dixia Cheng, the underground city of Beijing, a vast Cold War survival network built not by machines or professional construction crews, but by ordinary citizens, factory workers, students, farmers, shopkeepers. They dug with shovels and bare hands beneath their own neighborhoods while the world above them moved on without a clue. The project began in 1969. The Cold War was not just a standoff between Washington and Moscow anymore. China had broken from the Soviet Union, and the relationship between the two communist giants had collapsed into something far more dangerous than political disagreement. Border skirmishes along the Ussuri River had turned into open military conflict. Soviet troops were massing near the Chinese border, and intelligence reaching Beijing suggested that Moscow was considering a preemptive nuclear strike against Chinese military installations. Mao Zedong looked at that threat and made a decision that was as radical as anything he had ever ordered. He told the people of Beijing to dig, not soldiers, not engineers, the people. Neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, ordinary residents were mobilized to tunnel beneath their own city and build a refuge that could survive a nuclear attack from above. The directive was simple in words and staggering in scale. Every neighborhood committee was responsible for its own section. People dug before work and after work. Children helped carry dirt. Elderly residents passed bricks. There were no construction blueprints distributed to the public, no central engineering authority managing every detail at ground level. There was just the order, the urgency, and the earth beneath their feet. What they built over the following years was something the world had never quite seen before. Not a military base, not a simple bomb shelter. An entire parallel city designed to keep Beijing alive underground even if everything on the surface was gone. Hospitals, warehouses, restaurants, theaters, factories, wells, ventilation systems, schools. A city built for the end of the world, hidden beneath one of the most populated capitals on Earth. And almost nobody outside China knew it existed. The order came from the top, but the shovels came from the people. There were no tunnel-boring machines lowered into the earth beneath Beijing's hutongs. No German engineering firms contracted to manage the excavation. No laser-guided drilling rigs cutting precise corridors through bedrock. What China had in 1969 was something different, something that in many ways was more powerful than any machine. It had an enormous, disciplined, and deeply motivated population that believed it was digging for its own survival. Mao's directive moved through the Communist Party structure quickly and reached neighborhood committees across the city within weeks. Each committee became responsible for organizing its own residents into construction brigades. Factory workers showed up before their morning shifts with picks and shovels. University students were assigned digging quotas. School children carried baskets of loose soil up improvised ladders to the surface. Elderly residents mixed mortar and passed bricks through narrow underground passages that smelled of wet clay and kerosene lanterns. The work happened mostly at night and in the early morning hours, when regular life above ground was quietest. Families dug beneath their own courtyards and connected their section to the tunnel running beneath their street. Streets connected to district corridors. District corridors connected to the main arteries of the network. The entire system grew organically, block by block, like roots spreading beneath a forest floor. Except these roots were dug by human hands in near darkness, sometimes only a few meters below the foundations of standing buildings. The engineering challenges were significant even without heavy machinery. Beijing's soil varies across the city, and crews encountered everything from loose, sandy layers that collapsed without warning to harder-packed earth that resisted every swing of a pickaxe. Tunnel walls had to be reinforced manually using brick, stone, and whatever concrete materials could be sourced locally. Ceiling supports were improvised. Ventilation shafts were punched upward to the surface and disguised as ordinary street fixtures. Drain covers, well openings, the bases of small structures. At its peak, the project involved somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 Beijing residents actively participating in construction. The total length of tunnels that eventually spread beneath the city reached an estimated 30 kilometers in the core network. Some accounts suggest the broader connected system stretched considerably further across surrounding districts. No American construction project has ever been built this way. No federal highway, no dam, no military installation was ever handed to ordinary citizens and completed through sheer collective labor at this scale. What Beijing produced was not polished or perfect, but it was real, it was massive, and it was finished faster than anyone outside China thought possible. By the early 1970s, the digging was largely done. The underground city existed. Now, it had to become somewhere people could actually live. When the digging stopped, what remained beneath Beijing was not a network of empty tunnels. It was a functioning world. The people who built Dixia Cheng had not simply carved escape routes through the earth. They had constructed something far more ambitious, a self-contained underground civilization. This civilization was designed to keep an entire city alive for an indefinite period after a nuclear strike destroyed everything above. Walking through the completed network in the early 1970s, you would not have felt like you were in a bomb shelter. You would have felt like you had stepped into a parallel version of Beijing that just happened to have no sky. The scale of what was built underground is still difficult to fully absorb. The network contained dedicated medical facilities with operating rooms and recovery wards, stocked with supplies, and staffed by assigned personnel. These personnel knew their underground posts the same way a soldier knows a foxhole. There were grain warehouses capable of feeding large portions of the population for months. Fresh water access was solved through hand-dug wells that tapped underground aquifers. This meant the city below could survive even if every surface water system was destroyed or contaminated. But survival was not the only thing the designers had in mind. Dixia Cheng was also built for morale. And that detail says everything about how seriously Beijing took the possibility that people might need to live underground, not for days, but for months or years. There were restaurants down there, small canteens where underground residents could gather and eat a hot meal rather than simply ration emergency supplies in the dark. There were mushroom farms growing food in the tunnels themselves, using the consistent underground temperature and controlled humidity to produce harvests without sunlight. There were barbershops. There were factories where light manufacturing could continue underground, keeping economic activity alive even as the surface burned. There were entertainment spaces, simple theaters and gathering rooms, because planners understood that human beings deprived of purpose and community fall apart far faster than they starve. Ventilation was one of the most critical engineering achievements inside the network. The system relied on a combination of manually operated air pumps, natural pressure differentials between tunnel sections, and filtered intake shafts disguised at street level. In the event of a chemical or biological attack, many sections could be sealed and air filtered independently. Entrances were hidden inside ordinary buildings throughout the city, beneath the floors of restaurants, behind the walls of factories, underneath residential courtyards. An estimated 90 separate access points were distributed across Beijing, so that no single bomb strike could cut the population off from the underground entirely. This was not a shelter, it was a backup civilization, built one shovel at a time, waiting silently beneath one of the world's great cities for a war that, thankfully, never came. To understand why Beijing buried an entire city underground, you have to understand just how close the world came to a war that most Americans never learned about in school. The Sino-Soviet split is one of the most consequential geopolitical ruptures of the 20th century, and it remains chronically underappreciated in the West. Through the 1950s, China and the Soviet Union had been ideological partners. two communist giants sharing technology, military advisors, and a common enemy in the capitalist world led by Washington. But by the early 1960s, the relationship had curdled into something resembling open hostility. Mao and Khrushchev disagreed on ideology, on strategy, and on which nation had the right to lead the global communist movement. Soviet advisors were withdrawn from China. Aid programs were canceled. The border between the two countries, stretching thousands of miles across some of the most remote terrain on Earth, became a line of mutual suspicion. Then it became a line of blood. In March 1969, Chinese and Soviet forces clashed directly on Zhenbao Island in the Ussuri River, along the Manchurian border. Soldiers died on both sides. The skirmishes continued through the spring and summer, and behind closed doors in Moscow, Soviet officials began raising a possibility that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier: a preemptive nuclear strike against Chinese military and industrial targets before China's own nuclear arsenal could grow large enough to pose a serious threat. The Soviets quietly sounded out the Nixon administration about how Washington might respond to such a strike. The fact that Moscow felt it necessary to consult the Americans tells you everything about how seriously the Kremlin was considering the option. Beijing received intelligence about these discussions. What reached Mao was alarming enough to trigger the mobilization of an entire city. The calculation was straightforward and brutal. If Soviet missiles were coming, the only way to preserve the Chinese state, its leadership, and enough of its population to rebuild afterward was to put them somewhere missiles could not reach: underground, beneath the capital itself. This was not paranoia. It was a rational response to a genuine and documented threat from a nuclear-armed neighbor that had already demonstrated willingness to use military force. The United States spent the Cold War building missile silos, fallout shelters, and hardened command bunkers. China built something different in scale and philosophy. It tried to bring the entire civilian population of its capital city underground with it. The fear was real, the threat was real, and the hole they dug in response was real enough to still be there today. The war never came. And without a war, an underground city has very little to do. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the geopolitical temperature between China and the Soviet Union slowly began to drop. The border skirmishes faded. Diplomatic channels reopened. The specific nightmare scenario that had driven hundreds of thousands of Beijing residents to dig through the night, a Soviet nuclear first strike against the Chinese capital, receded from the realm of realistic possibility. And as the threat dissolved, the vast network beneath Beijing quietly lost its purpose. Maintenance became inconsistent. Sections that had been carefully stocked with emergency supplies were gradually emptied or left to deteriorate. The ventilation systems that planners had engineered with such care began to fail in places without the constant attention they required. Water seeped into tunnel junctions. Brick walls cracked. The mushroom farms went dark. The underground restaurants closed. The operating rooms that had been kept in readiness for mass casualty events were stripped of their equipment. One by one, the access points hidden inside Beijing's restaurants and factories and residential courtyards were sealed, forgotten, or built over entirely as the city above expanded and modernized at a pace nobody in 1969 could have imagined. For most of the 1980s and 1990s, Dixia Cheng existed in a strange limbo. It was too large to disappear completely and too politically sensitive to discuss openly. The government neither publicized it nor formally decommissioned it. It simply sat there beneath the streets, accumulating dust and silence, while Beijing transformed itself into one of the fastest-growing cities on the planet directly above it. The rediscovery came gradually and from unexpected directions. As Beijing's construction boom accelerated through the 1990s and into the 2000s, workers digging foundations for new apartment towers and commercial developments kept breaking through into tunnel sections that appeared on no official blueprint. Urban explorers began finding their way into accessible sections and documenting what they found. Stories started circulating about the scale of the network, about the facilities it once contained, about the thousands of ordinary people who had built it with their hands. By the early 2000s, the government made a tentative and somewhat awkward decision to acknowledge and partially open the network to the public. A section near Tiananmen, in the heart of old Beijing, was cleaned up and opened for tours. For a brief period, it became a minor tourist attraction. Then portions were leased to migrants as cheap underground housing, then converted into budget shops and storage spaces. A city built to survive the apocalypse had become a discount mall. History has a complicated sense of humor. There is a question that stays with you long after you learn about Dixia Cheng. Not the engineering question, not the historical question, the human one. What does it say about a society that it could convince hundreds of thousands of ordinary people to spend years digging a secret city beneath their own homes, in silence, without complaint, without payment beyond the belief that they were protecting their families from annihilation? What kind of fear produces that? What kind of trust or control makes it possible? Americans tend to think about Cold War civil defense in terms of duck and cover drills and backyard fallout shelters, individual responses to collective threats. The Chinese response to the same era of nuclear anxiety was something categorically different in both scale and philosophy. It was not about giving individuals a chance to survive. It was about preserving the collective entirely, the city, the population, the state, the civilization, by moving it underground as a single organism. That instinct did not disappear when the tunnels were sealed. Today, China operates the largest network of underground military installations in the world. The system known informally as the Underground Great Wall, a vast complex of hardened tunnels housing nuclear weapons, missile systems, and strategic reserves, represents the modern evolution of exactly the same logic that built Dixia Cheng in 1969. The technology is incomparably more sophisticated. The machinery is real this time. But the core idea is identical. When the threat comes from above, you go below. Other nations are reaching similar conclusions. Norway has its mountain fortresses. Switzerland still maintains one of the most extensive civilian bunker systems on Earth, capable of sheltering its entire population. Sweden reactivated and updated its Cold War shelter network in recent years as European security deteriorated. Even the United States has returned serious attention to continuity of government facilities that were largely mothballed after 1991. The age of believing that nuclear threats belonged permanently to the past is over. And in that context, Beijing's underground city looks less like a relic of paranoid Maoist mobilization, and more like an early draft of something the entire world is slowly starting to reconsider. Dixia Cheng was built by people who were afraid. They expressed that fear the only way their government gave them, with shovels, in the dark, beneath the city they loved. The tunnels they left behind are crumbling now, repurposed and half forgotten, buried under 30 more feet of modern Beijing that has no memory of what was sacrificed to build what lies below it. But the instinct that created them is not crumbling. If anything, it is being reinforced, one tunnel at a time.